The first time Caleb Kane killed a man, he was 15 years old, and it wasn't even his fight. He'd been hauling water from the creek behind the farmstead when he heard his brother's voice cut through the evening air, sharp, urgent, wrong. Caleb dropped the bucket and ran, boots slipping on wet grass, heart hammering against his ribs like it knew something he didn't yet. By the time he reached the barn, Jesse was already on the ground, blood spreading dark across his shirt, and a Union deserter stood over him with a carbine still smoking. Caleb didn't think. He grabbed the pitchfork leaning against the barn wall and drove it clean through the man's side before the stranger could even turn around. The deserter went down hard, choking on his own blood, and Caleb stood there shaking, the wooden handle still clutched in both hands, splinters biting into his palms. Jesse coughed, tried to sit up. Good, Cale. You did good. But it didn't feel good. It felt like the ground had opened up beneath him and he was falling, and there was nothing to catch him, but more falling. Their father found them an hour later. He looked at the body, looked at Jesse's wound, looked at Caleb standing there with blood on his hands and something broken in his eyes. "You boys are going to have to go," he said quietly. "Union patrol comes through here and finds this, they'll burn us out. Maybe worse." "Pa." "No argument, Jesse. You take your brother and you ride north. Find your uncle's people. They'll know what to do with you." That was how it started. Not with a choice, but with a pitchfork and a dead man in the dirt and a father who wouldn't meet his youngest son's eyes. They rode out before dawn, Jesse hunched over his horse's neck, Caleb following behind with everything he owned tied in a blanket roll. The war had been raging for 2 years by then, tearing through Missouri like a fever, and the borderlands were a mess of militias, deserters, and men who'd forgotten which side they were even fighting for. Uncle Tom wasn't really their uncle, just a distant cousin their father had mentioned once or twice. But he ran with a group of riders who operated in the unmarked spaces between Union and Confederate lines, and that was close enough to family when you had nowhere else to go. They found the camp 3 days later, tucked into a hollow surrounded by dense timber and watchful men. Rourke Maddox was standing by the fire when they rode in. Caleb would remember that moment for the rest of his life. The way Rourke turned, firelight catching the sharp planes of his face, eyes pale as winter ice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a presence that made every other man in camp look smaller just by proximity. "Tom," Rourke said, voice low and easy. "These the Kane boys?" Tom nodded. "Jesse and Caleb. Jesse took a round from a deserter. Kid here put the man down with a pitchfork." Rourke's gaze shifted to Caleb, and something flickered there. Amusement, maybe, or recognition. "A pitchfork. That's resourceful." Caleb didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Rourke stepped closer, studying him the way a man might study a horse he was thinking about buying. "How old are you, boy?" 15? 15. Rourke smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know what we do here, Caleb Kane?" "No, sir." "We survive, and we make damn sure the people who try to grind us into the dirt pay for it." He glanced at Jesse, who was swaying in the saddle, pale and sweating. "Get your brother to the medical tent. Then come find me. We'll talk about whether you're tough enough to ride with us." That night, while Jesse slept off the laudanum, Caleb sat by the fire and listened to the men talk. They weren't soldiers, not really. Some had been, once, but the war had chewed them up and spit them out into something else. They talked about raids and ambushes, about Union patrols and supply trains, about towns that had turned on their own people and deserved what they got. Rourke sat across from Caleb, cleaning a revolver with slow, deliberate movements. "You scared, kid?" he asked without looking up. "No, sir." Rourke smiled. "Liar, but that's all right. Scared keeps you sharp, stupid gets you killed." He reassembled the pistol with practiced ease, then slid it into his holster. "Your brother's not going to be fit to ride for a while. That means you're on your own. You ready for that?" Caleb thought about his father's face, the way he'd looked at him like he was already gone. Thought about the deserter choking on his own blood. Thought about Jesse, who'd always been the strong one, the brave one, lying broken in a tent because Caleb hadn't been fast enough. "Yes, sir." "Good." Rourke stood, stretched. "Tomorrow morning, you're riding with Cole and Garrett. Supply run. Easy work. Don't screw it up. The supply run wasn't easy. They hit a Union wagon train just after dawn, 6 riders against a dozen guards. Caleb stayed low in the saddle, rifle in hand, heart trying to climb out of his throat as bullets snapped through the air around him. Cole, a wiry man with a scar running from his eye to his jaw, grinned like this was the best thing that had happened to him all week. "Stay close, kid. Don't let him get a clean shot." Caleb fired twice, didn't know if he hit anything, and then they were through, horses pounding up the ridge while the guards scrambled to reload. By the time they circled back, the fight was over. 3 guards dead, the rest scattered. Garrett was already pulling crates off the wagon, tossing supplies to the others. "Medicine, ammunition, hardtack," he called out. "Good haul." Cole clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "You did fine, kid. Didn't freeze up, didn't run. That's better than most." But Caleb couldn't stop looking at the bodies sprawled in the dirt, couldn't stop thinking about how easy it had been to pull the trigger, how little it had taken to cross that line. That night, Rourke found him sitting alone at the edge of camp. "You all right?" Caleb shrugged. Rourke sat down beside him, boots creaking. "First time's always the hardest, but it gets easier." "Does it?" "Has to." Rourke pulled out a flask, took a drink, offered it to Caleb. "You know what the difference is between us and them? They've got orders, regulations, a whole damn government telling them what to do. We've just got each other. And out here, that's the only thing that matters. You take care of your brothers, they take care of you. That's the rule." Caleb took the flask, swallowed. The whiskey burned all the way down. "What if I can't do this?" Rourke's expression hardened. "Then you leave. But if you stay, you're all in. No halfway. No second guessing. You trust me, you trust the men, and you do what needs to be done. Understood?" Caleb handed back the flask. "Understood." Over the next 2 years, Caleb learned what it meant to ride with Rourke Maddox. He learned how to move through enemy territory without leaving a trail, how to read the land like a map, how to know when to fight and when to disappear. He learned which men he could trust with his life and which ones he needed to watch. And he learned that Rourke's word was law. The camp operated like a family, fractured, violent, but bound by something deeper than blood. Rourke didn't just lead them. He held them together through sheer force of will, a gravitational pull that kept everyone in orbit even when things got ugly. And things got ugly. The war wasn't just soldiers fighting soldiers anymore. It had bled into homes, into towns, into the lives of people who'd never picked up a gun. Union forces cracked down hard on anyone suspected of aiding the Southern cause, arresting civilians, burning farms, tearing families apart. Rourke's response was swift and brutal. When a Union patrol hanged 3 men in a town called Ashford for refusing to swear loyalty, Rourke led a raid that left the patrol dead and the town commander's head mounted on a fence post. When Union troops burned out a settlement that had sheltered Rourke's riders, Rourke burned 2 of theirs in return. Caleb rode in every raid, fought in every skirmish, and somewhere along the way he stopped flinching when the guns went off. Jesse recovered eventually, but he was different, quieter, harder. He didn't talk about what had happened back home, didn't talk about their father or the life they'd left behind. He just rode, fought, and followed Rourke like the rest of them. And Caleb followed too, because what else was there? By the time he turned 17, he'd killed more men than he could count. He'd seen towns burn, families torn apart, violence so casual it stopped feeling like violence and started feeling like weather. Something inevitable, something you just endured. But there were moments, late at night when the camp was quiet and the fire burned low, when he'd catch himself staring into the flames and wondering if this was all there was, if this was who he'd always be. Rourke must have sensed it because one night he sat down beside Caleb and said, "You're thinking too much, kid." Caleb didn't deny it. "You want to know the secret to surviving this?" Rourke said. "You don't ask questions. You don't wonder if it's right or wrong. You just do what needs to be done, and you live with it. That's all any of us can do." "What if I can't?" Rourke looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in his pale eyes. "Then you're already dead. You just don't know it yet." The turning point came in the spring of 1863. Union forces had been tightening their grip on the borderlands, issuing sweeping orders to arrest anyone connected to the outlaw bands. Entire families were rounded up, Men, women, children, and thrown into makeshift prisons while the military sorted out who was guilty and who was just unlucky. Rourke's younger sisters were among them. Emma and Sarah Maddox, both barely out of childhood, had been living with an aunt in a town called Parkville. When Union soldiers came through, they arrested every woman and girl with ties to known raiders and locked them in a 3-story brick building that had once been a boarding house. Rourke moved heaven and earth trying to get them out. He sent messages, bribed officials, even reached out to Confederate commanders for help. Nothing worked. Then one night, the building collapsed. No one knew why. Some said it was shoddy construction, others said sabotage. But when the dust settled, 8 girls were dead, including Emma. Sarah survived, but she'd never walk right again. Rourke didn't say a word when he got the news. He just stood there, staring at nothing, and then he walked into the woods and didn't come back for 3 days. When he returned, he was different. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something cold and absolute. "They want a war?" he said, voice flat. "They'll get one." He started gathering riders, not just from their camp, but from every outlaw band within 100 miles. Men who'd lost family, men who'd been burned out, men who had nothing left to lose. Within 2 weeks, he had 300. Caleb stood in the center of camp, watching them arrive. Hard-eyed men on harder horses, armed to the teeth and ready for blood. Jesse found him there. "You know where this is going, right?" Caleb nodded. "You ready for it?" Caleb didn't answer because he didn't know. Rourke called them together the night before the raid. He stood on a wagon bed, firelight casting long shadows across his face, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of camp. "They took our families. They locked them up like animals and let them die. And they think we're just going to roll over and take it." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Tomorrow, we show them what happens when you push men too far. We ride on Red Hollow. We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we make damn sure they remember what it costs to cross us." A roar went up from the crowd, 300 voices shouting as one. Caleb felt it in his chest, the rage, the grief, the terrible certainty that tomorrow would change everything. Rourke's gaze found him across the fire, and for just a moment, Caleb saw something there. An invitation, a question, a challenge. "Are you with me?" Caleb didn't look away. The next morning, they rode for Red Hollow. The town sat in a valley, surrounded by low hills and open farmland. It wasn't a military target. There was a small Union garrison, but most of the people living there were civilians trying to stay out of the war. That didn't matter to Rourke. They came in at dawn, 300 riders spreading out across the hillsides like a noose pulling tight. Caleb rode beside Jesse, rifle across his saddle, heart pounding so hard he could barely hear the hoofbeats. "You all right?" Jesse asked. "Yeah." Jesse didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Rourke gave the signal, and they charged. The first shots rang out before they even reached the edge of town. Soldiers scrambling to form a line, civilians running for cover. Caleb fired into the chaos, saw a man go down, didn't let himself think about it. The garrison didn't stand a chance. Within minutes, it was overrun, soldiers dead or fleeing, and Rourke's men poured into the streets. That's when everything went wrong. The raid didn't stop at the garrison. It spread like wildfire. Men breaking into homes, dragging people into the streets, settling old scores that had nothing to do with the war. Caleb saw a man shot in his own doorway, saw a woman screaming as her house burned, saw children hiding behind overturned wagons while bullets tore through the air around them. He tried to pull back, tried to find Jesse, but the chaos was too thick, too fast. And then he saw Rourke. He was standing in the middle of the street, pistol in hand, a young Union recruit kneeling in front of him. The kid couldn't have been more than 16, unarmed, hands raised in surrender. A woman, his mother, Caleb realized, was on her knees beside him, begging. "Please," she sobbed, "please, he's just a boy." Rourke looked at her, then at the kid, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the street, impossibly loud, impossibly final. The woman collapsed over her son's body, screaming, and Rourke just turned and walked away. Caleb stood frozen, the world tilting sideways, everything he'd believed about Rourke, about the Brotherhood, about who they were, crashing down around him. This wasn't war. This wasn't justice. This was something else entirely. He found Jesse later, near the edge of town, covered in soot and blood. "We need to go," Caleb said. Jesse stared at him. "What?" "We need to leave. Now." "Caleb, I'm done, Jesse. I'm done with this." Jesse grabbed his arm. "You walk away from Rourke. You walk away from everything. You understand that?" Caleb pulled free. "I understand." He turned his horse and rode out of Red Hollow without looking back, the smoke rising behind him like a monument to everything he'd lost. The first 3 days, Caleb didn't stop moving. He rode north through timber so thick the sunlight barely reached the ground, crossed streams swollen with spring runoff, and slept in his saddle when exhaustion finally dragged him under. He didn't know where he was going, only that it needed to be far from Red Hollow, far from Rourke, far from the sound of that woman's screams. On the 4th day, his horse went lame. Caleb dismounted in a clearing beside a narrow creek, checked the mare's front left hoof, and found a stone wedged deep in the frog. He worked it out carefully, but the damage was done. She couldn't carry him anymore, not without risking permanent injury. "Sorry, girl," he murmured, running a hand down her neck. "Looks like we're both done running for a while." He led her to water, let her drink, then unsaddled her and turned her loose. She'd find her way to a farm eventually, or maybe a band of wild horses. Either way, she'd have a better chance without him. Caleb shouldered his rifle and bedroll and started walking. By nightfall, he reached a town called Millerville, a scatter of buildings huddled around a crossroads, barely big enough to warrant a name. There was a general store, a blacksmith, a church with peeling paint, and a boarding house that looked like it might collapse if someone sneezed too hard. Caleb pushed through the boarding house door and found an old woman behind the counter, knitting something shapeless and gray. "Need a room," he said. She looked him over, took in the dust, the rifle, the hollow look in his eyes, and quoted him a price. He paid without argument and climbed the stairs to a room that smelled like mildew and regret. That night, he dreamed of Red Hollow. Dreamed of the boy on his knees, the woman sobbing, Rourke's finger tightening on the trigger. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat, and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. He stayed in Millerville for 2 weeks, doing odd jobs for the blacksmith in exchange for meals and a place to sleep. The work was simple, hauling coal, mending tools, keeping the forge hot, and it gave him something to focus on besides the weight in his chest. The blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man named Harlan, didn't ask questions. He just pointed to what needed doing and paid Caleb at the end of each day. On the 15th day, a rider came through town. Caleb was outside the smithy repairing a wagon axle when he heard the hoofbeats. He looked up and felt his stomach drop. It was Cole, the wiry, scar-faced man who'd ridden with Rourke for as long as Caleb could remember. Cole dismounted, tied his horse, and walked straight toward him. "Caleb Kane," he said, voice flat. "Didn't think I'd find you hiding in a place like this." Caleb set down the hammer, wiped his hands on his pants. "I'm not hiding." "Sure you're not." Cole's gaze flicked to the smithy, then back to Caleb. "Rourke wants to talk to you." "I've got nothing to say to him." "Wasn't a request, kid." Caleb felt the weight of the rifle leaning against the wall behind him, calculated the distance, the odds. Cole was fast, but Caleb had the advantage of proximity. Cole must have seen the thought cross his face because he smiled, thin and cold. "You really want to do this? Here? Now?" Caleb exhaled slowly. "What does he want?" "Like I said, to talk. You owe him that much." "I don't owe him anything." Cole's expression hardened. "You rode with us for 2 years. You ate at his fire, slept under his protection, and called him brother. You think you can just walk away without a word?" "I think I can do whatever I want." "Then you're dumber than I thought." Cole stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me, Caleb. Rourke's not the same since Red Hollow. Men are deserting, supplies are running thin, and the Union's coming down on us harder than ever. He needs people he can trust, and whether you like it or not, you're one of them." "I saw what he did," Caleb said quietly. "I saw him execute a kid in front of his mother. You want me to pretend that didn't happen?" Cole's jaw tightened. "That kid was wearing a Union uniform. He made his choice. He was 16, unarmed, begging for his life. And how many of our boys died begging? How many got strung up by Union patrols while their families watched? Cole's voice rose, sharp and bitter. You think war's got rules, Caleb? You think there's some line we're not supposed to cross? They crossed it first. Rourke's just making sure they pay. Caleb shook his head. That's not justice. That's just more blood. Call it whatever you want, but you don't get to walk away clean. You were there. You rode with us. You're part of this whether you like it or not. Before Caleb could respond, Harlan stepped out of the smithy, hammer in hand. This fella bothering you, son? He asked, his tone mild, but his grip on the hammer very deliberate. Cole glanced at Harlan, then back at Caleb. Think about what I said. Rourke's camped 20 miles west of here, near the old Blackwood homestead. You've got 2 days to show up, or he'll come looking for you himself. He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode out without another word. Harlan watched him go, then looked at Caleb. Friend of yours? Used to be. Harlan nodded slowly. You in some kind of trouble, boy? Yeah. The kind that's going to follow you here? Caleb met his eyes. Probably. Harlan considered that, then shrugged. Well, I reckon you've got a choice to make. Whatever you decide, don't do it on my account. I've lived through one war already. I can live through another. That night, Caleb sat on the steps of the boarding house and tried to figure out what the hell he was supposed to do. He could run, head west maybe, or south toward Texas. Change his name, start over, hope Rourke never found him. Or he could go back. Face Rourke, say what needed saying, and hope that 2 years of brotherhood counted for something. Neither option felt right. The problem was, Cole was right about one thing. Caleb couldn't walk away clean. He'd been part of this. He'd ridden into Red Hollow, pulled the trigger, watched the town burn. The fact that he'd left didn't change what he'd done. And if Rourke came looking for him, he wouldn't come alone. Caleb thought about Harlan, about the old woman at the boarding house, about the handful of families trying to survive in this forgotten corner of the world. If Rourke's men showed up here, those people would pay the price. He couldn't let that happen. 2 days later, Caleb saddled a borrowed horse and rode west. The Blackwood homestead was a burned-out shell surrounded by scorched fields and broken fences. Rourke's camp sprawled across the property like a wound. Tents and lean-tos clustered around cook fires. Horses tethered in makeshift corrals. Caleb counted maybe 50 men, less than a third of what they'd had before Red Hollow. He rode in slowly, hands visible, rifle slung across his back. A guard stepped out to meet him, rifle leveled. State your business. I'm here to see Rourke. The guard studied him, then nodded toward the center of camp. He's expecting you. Caleb dismounted, tied his horse, and walked through the camp. Men watched him pass, some with recognition, others with suspicion. No one spoke. Rourke was sitting outside the largest tent, cleaning a carbine. He didn't look up when Caleb approached. Took you long enough, he said. Caleb stopped a few feet away. Cole said you wanted to talk. I did. Rourke set the carbine aside, finally meeting Caleb's eyes. You left without a word. That's not how brothers part ways. We're not brothers. Rourke's expression didn't change. No? After everything we've been through, that's what you're going with? After what I saw in Red Hollow, yeah. That's what I'm going with. Rourke stood, and suddenly the space between them felt smaller. You saw war, Caleb. Ugly, brutal, necessary war. You think I wanted to pull that trigger? You think I enjoyed it? I think you didn't hesitate. Because hesitation gets people killed. Rourke's voice was low, controlled. That boy wasn't some innocent bystander. He was wearing a uniform. He was part of the machine that locked my sisters in a death trap. You want me to apologize for that? I won't. He was unarmed, surrendering. And if I'd let him go? What then? He runs back to his unit, tells them everything he saw, and the next time they come for us, they bring twice as many men. Is that what you wanted? Caleb's hands clenched into fists. I wanted you to remember we're supposed to be better than them. Rourke laughed, short, bitter. Better? Caleb, there is no better. There's just survival. You either do what it takes to protect your own, or you watch them die. That's the only choice there is. Then I choose neither. Rourke's jaw tightened. You don't get that option. You rode with us. You killed for us. You're part of this whether you accept it or not. I'm done, Caleb said flatly. I came here to tell you that face to face. I'm out. For a long moment, Rourke just stared at him. Then he shook his head, something almost like disappointment crossing his face. You know what happens to deserters, Caleb? Yeah, I do. Rourke stepped closer, close enough that Caleb could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight he was carrying. I could put a bullet in you right now. No one here would stop me. Hell, most of them would help dig the grave. So do it. Rourke's hand moved to his pistol, rested there. The camp had gone silent, every man watching, waiting. Then Rourke let out a slow breath and stepped back. Get out, he said quietly. Take your horse and go. But if I see you again, Caleb, if you cross my path, if you get in my way, if you so much as breathe wrong, I won't hesitate. Not for you, not for anyone. Caleb held his gaze. Understood. He turned and walked back to his horse, feeling Rourke's eyes on him the entire way. He mounted, turned the horse toward the road, and rode out of camp without looking back. A mile down the road, his hands started shaking. He pulled the horse to a stop, dismounted, and leaned against a tree, trying to breathe through the adrenaline crashing over him. He'd done it. He'd walked away from Rourke Maddox and lived, but he knew, deep in his bones, that this wasn't over. Caleb drifted for weeks after that, moving from town to town, taking work where he could find it. He kept his head down, didn't use his real name, and avoided anywhere that looked like it might attract Rourke's attention. But the war followed him anyway. Union forces were tightening their grip on the borderlands, issuing increasingly brutal orders in their effort to crush the outlaw bands. Entire regions were declared hostile territory, subject to military rule. Civilians suspected of aiding the raiders were arrested without trial, their property seized or burned. Caleb saw it everywhere he went, families torn apart, homes destroyed, people living in fear of both sides. In a town called Grafton, he watched Union soldiers drag a farmer out of his house and beat him bloody in front of his children because someone claimed he'd fed a group of riders the week before. In another town, he saw a woman hanged from a telegraph pole, a sign around her neck that read, Confederate Sympathizer. The violence was relentless, indiscriminate, and it didn't matter whether you'd picked a side or tried to stay neutral. If you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you paid the price. Caleb kept moving, kept working, kept trying to outrun the guilt that followed him like a shadow. He was in a settlement called Riverside when he heard the news. He'd been hauling lumber for a carpenter, earning just enough to keep himself fed, when a rider came through town with word from the south. Rourke had hit another town, a place called Willow Creek. The raid had been smaller than Red Hollow, but no less brutal. A dozen Union soldiers dead, twice as many civilians caught in the crossfire, buildings torched, supplies stolen. The Union's response had been swift and merciless. They'd sent an entire regiment into the area, burning out every homestead within 10 miles, arresting anyone who couldn't prove their loyalty, and offering a bounty on Rourke Maddox's head that made Caleb's blood run cold. $5,000, dead or alive. That kind of money would turn brother against brother, friend against friend. Rourke's own men would start looking at him sideways, weighing loyalty against survival. Caleb tried to tell himself it wasn't his problem anymore. He'd made his choice, walked away, started over. But late at night, when the work was done and the silence pressed in, he couldn't stop thinking about Jesse. His brother had still been with Rourke when Caleb left. And if the Union was coming down this hard, if the bounty was that high, Jesse was in just as much danger as Rourke. Caleb told himself he didn't care. Jesse had made his choice, same as Caleb. But blood was blood, and no matter how far he ran, he couldn't change that. A week later, he ran into a man named Garrett, one of Rourke's old riders, now traveling alone. They crossed paths in a roadside tavern, and Garrett recognized Caleb immediately. "Caleb Kane," he said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Heard you were dead." "Not yet." Garrett grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, well, give it time. The way things are going, none of us are going to make it through this." "Where's Rourke now?" Garrett's grin faded. "Last I heard, holed up somewhere in the hills near the Arkansas line. Union's got patrols everywhere, and half his men have deserted. The ones left are either true believers or too stupid to know when to quit." "What about Jesse?" Garrett's expression shifted, something like pity crossing his face. Your brother's still with him. Stubborn bastard won't leave, no matter how bad it gets. Caleb's chest tightened. He all right? For now. But Rourke's losing it, Caleb. He's not thinking straight anymore. Every raid's more reckless than the last, and the men are starting to notice. It's only a matter of time before someone decides that bounty's worth more than loyalty. You think someone will turn on him? Garrett shrugged. I think everyone's got a breaking point. Rourke found his in Red Hollow. Question is, what's yours? Caleb didn't have an answer for that. Garrett stood, tossed a coin on the table. For what it's worth, you made the right call walking away. Some of us just didn't have the guts to do it. He walked out, leaving Caleb alone with his thoughts and a decision he didn't want to make. That night, Caleb stared at the ceiling of another nameless boarding house and weighed his options. He could keep running, keep pretending he wasn't responsible for what came next. Or he could go back. Not for Rourke, never for Rourke, but for Jesse. His brother was too loyal, too stubborn to see what Rourke had become. And if Caleb didn't do something, Jesse was going to die alongside him. By morning, Caleb had made up his mind. He bought supplies, saddled his horse, and rode south. Finding Rourke's camp wasn't easy. The Union had patrols on every road, and Caleb had to move carefully, avoiding checkpoints and staying off the main trails. It took him 5 days to reach the hills near the Arkansas line, and another 2 to find the camp. It was smaller than before, maybe 20 men, all of them looking gaunt and hunted. The tents were ragged, the horses thin, and the air carried the smell of desperation. Caleb tied his horse and walked in, half expecting someone to shoot him on sight. Instead, Jesse stepped out of a tent and froze. Caleb? Yeah. Jesse crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and grabbed him in a crushing embrace. What the hell are you doing here? Looking for you. Jesse pulled back, studying him. You shouldn't have come. It's not safe. I know. That's why I'm here. Before Jesse could respond, Rourke emerged from the largest tent. He looked different, thinner, harder, with dark circles under his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. Caleb Kane, he said, voice flat. Didn't think I'd see you again. I'm not here for you, Caleb said. I'm here for Jesse. Rourke's gaze shifted to Jesse, then back to Caleb. That's so. Yeah. Rourke studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough. You want to talk to your brother? Talk. But don't try to poison him against me. We've got enough problems without that. Caleb didn't argue. He just followed Jesse to the edge of camp where they could talk without being overheard. You need to leave, Caleb said quietly. This isn't going to end well, Jesse. You know that. Jesse shook his head. I can't just walk away. Rourke needs me. Rourke's lost, Jesse. He's not the man we followed anymore. He's chasing ghosts, and he's going to get everyone killed. He's doing what he has to do. No, he's doing what he wants to do. There's a difference. Caleb grabbed Jesse's arm. Come with me. We can disappear, start over somewhere the war hasn't reached yet. Jesse pulled free. And do what? Pretend we didn't fight? Pretend we didn't lose people we cared about? I can't do that, Caleb. I can't just forget. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to survive. Jesse looked at him, something broken in his eyes. What if I don't deserve to? The words hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. Don't say that. Why not? It's true. You saw what we did in Red Hollow. You know what we've become. Then change. Walk away. Choose something different. Jesse laughed. Bitter. Hollow. You really think it's that simple? I think it's the only choice that matters. For a moment, Jesse didn't respond. Then he shook his head. I'm staying, Caleb. You can go if you want, but I'm staying. Caleb felt something inside him crack. Then you're going to die here. Maybe. But at least I'll die for something. Caleb turned and walked away before he said something he'd regret. He found Rourke standing by the fire, waiting. He won't leave, Caleb said. Rourke nodded. I know. You're killing him. You know that, right? Rourke's expression didn't change. We're all dying, Caleb. The only question is whether it means anything. This doesn't mean anything. It's just revenge dressed up as justice. Call it whatever you want. I'm not stopping. Rourke stepped closer. You came here to save your brother. I respect that. But you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved. Caleb stared at him, searching for some trace of the man he'd once followed, once trusted. He didn't find it. You're right, Caleb said quietly. I can't save him, but I'm not leaving him here to die alone. Rourke smiled, thin and cold. Then I guess you're staying. Caleb didn't answer. He just walked back to where Jesse was standing and sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke. And in the silence, Caleb realized he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd come back. Not for Rourke, not for the cause, but for his brother. And whatever came next, they'd face it together. The camp felt like a tomb with a heartbeat. Caleb spent the first night sitting watch at the perimeter, rifle across his knees, listening to the sounds of men who couldn't sleep. Coughs, muttered curses, the rustle of someone pacing inside a tent. Fear had a particular smell, sharp and sour, like metal left too long in the rain, and it hung over everything. Jesse found him just before dawn, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee that was more grounds than liquid. You didn't have to come back, Jesse said, handing him a cup. Yeah, I did. Jesse sat down beside him, staring out at the dark line of trees. You think we're going to make it out of this? Caleb took a sip of the bitter coffee. Honestly, I don't know. That's not very reassuring. You want me to lie? Jesse smiled, faint, tired. No, I've had enough of that. He paused, then added quietly, Rourke's planning something big. Won't say what, but he's been meeting with riders from other camps. Whatever it is, it's going to happen soon. How soon? Days, maybe. A week at most. Jesse looked at him. You sure you want to be here for it? Caleb thought about leaving, about taking Jesse's arm and dragging him out of this place, whether he wanted to go or not. But he knew his brother well enough to know that wouldn't work. Jesse had made his choice, and all Caleb could do was stand beside him when it went to hell. I'm sure, he said. 3 days later, the riders started arriving. They came in small groups, 2s and 3s, sometimes alone, slipping into camp after dark like ghosts. Caleb recognized a few faces from before Red Hollow, but most were strangers. Hard men with harder eyes, carrying scars and grudges in equal measure. By the end of the week, Rourke had gathered close to 100. Caleb watched them filter in, watched Rourke greet each one personally, clasping hands and speaking in low tones that didn't carry beyond the fire. Whatever he was offering them, it was enough to bring them here despite the bounty, despite the Union patrols, despite everything. On the 8th night, Rourke called everyone together. The men gathered in a clearing at the center of camp, firelight casting long shadows across their faces. Caleb stood near the back with Jesse, close enough to hear but far enough to keep some distance. Rourke climbed onto a fallen log so everyone could see him. He looked older in the firelight, worn down by the weight of everything he'd lost, but his voice was steady when he spoke. Most of you know why you're here, he began. The rest of you figured it out on the way. The Union thinks they can break us. They think if they burn enough homes, arrest enough families, and offer enough gold, we'll just disappear. A murmur ran through the crowd, agreement, anger, something darker. They took my sisters, Rourke continued, his voice hardening, locked them up like animals and let them die. And they've done the same to your people, your wives, your children, your kin. They've made it clear they don't see us as soldiers. They see us as vermin. Someone in the crowd shouted agreement, and others joined in. Rourke let the noise build, then raised a hand for silence. So we're going to remind them what happens when you push men too far. We're going to hit them where it hurts most. Not a garrison, not a supply train, a symbol. He paused, letting the words settle. Garrison Hill, he said. 300 Union soldiers, officers, supplies, and the regional command. They use it as a staging ground for every patrol in the territory. Take it, and we cripple their entire operation. Caleb felt his stomach drop. Garrison Hill wasn't just a military target. It was a fortified position, heavily defended with artillery and trained infantry. Hitting it with 100 riders wasn't a raid. It was a suicide mission. Jesse must have been thinking the same thing because he leaned close and whispered, "He's lost his mind." Caleb didn't disagree. One of the men near the front spoke up. "How many men they got?" 300, give or take, Rourke said. But most of them are green recruits. They're used to chasing down farmers, not fighting men who know what they're doing. And if we lose? Rourke's expression didn't change. Then we lose. But if we win, we send a message that'll echo across every territory from here to the Atlantic. We show them we're not broken, we're not finished, and we're not afraid. The crowd erupted, some cheering, others shouting questions, a few just standing silent and grim. Caleb watched Rourke soak it in, watched him feed off their anger and fear and turn it into something he could use. It was brilliant, in a terrible way, and it was going to get them all killed. After the meeting, Caleb cornered Rourke near his tent. "This is insane," he said without preamble. Rourke didn't look surprised to see him. "You got a better idea?" "Yeah, don't do it. Take what's left of your men and disappear. Head west, start over, live to fight another day. And let them think they won?" Rourke shook his head. "No, I'm done running. This isn't about winning. It's about survival." "Same thing." "It's not." Caleb stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You hit Garrison Hill, you're not sending a message. You're painting a target on everyone who rides with you. The Union won't stop until every last one of you is dead. They won't stop anyway. At least this way, we go down swinging. And what about the men who don't want to die for your revenge?" Rourke's jaw tightened. "Then they can leave. No one's forcing them to stay. You know they won't. You've got them so wound up they'd follow you straight into hell if you asked." "Good. That's exactly where we're going." Rourke turned to face him fully. "You don't like it, Caleb? There's the road. No hard feelings this time." Caleb held his gaze. "I'm not leaving, Jesse." "Then I guess you're coming with us." Caleb wanted to argue, to find some way to talk Rourke out of this, but he could see it in the other man's eyes. There was no reasoning with him anymore. Whatever part of Rourke had been capable of mercy or doubt had died in that collapsed building with his sister. All that was left was rage. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. Men cleaned weapons, checked ammunition, sharpened blades. Rourke laid out the plan in excruciating detail: approach routes, timing, assignments. He divided the men into groups, each with a specific objective. Caleb and Jesse were assigned to the main assault force, tasked with breaching the garrison's outer defenses and holding the line while others pushed deeper into the compound. "At least we'll be together," Jesse said, trying for optimism and failing. Caleb just nodded. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, unable to stop it. The night before the raid, he found himself sitting alone at the edge of camp, staring at the stars. Jesse joined him after a while, carrying a bottle of whiskey he'd traded for who knows what. "Figured we could use this," Jesse said, uncorking it and taking a long pull before handing it over. Caleb drank, felt the burn all the way down. "You scared?" "Terrified," Jesse admitted. "You?" "Yeah." They passed the bottle back and forth in silence for a while. "You ever think about what we'd be doing if the war hadn't happened?" Jesse asked eventually. Caleb considered it. "Probably still working the farm, helping Pa with the harvest. Maybe you'd have gotten married, settled down." Jesse laughed quietly. "Maybe. What about you?" "I don't know. Never thought that far ahead." "Well, you better start thinking about it now, because if we somehow make it through tomorrow, we're going to need a plan." Caleb looked at his brother, really looked at him, and saw the boy he'd grown up with beneath all the scars and hardness. "You thinking about leaving?" "Maybe. If we live." Jesse took another drink. "I'm tired, Caleb. Tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of watching good men die for reasons that stopped making sense a long time ago." "Then why stay?" Jesse was quiet for a long moment. "Because I don't know how to be anything else. This is all I've got left." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Jesse handed him the bottle. "I've killed men, Caleb, burned homes, done things I can't take back. What kind of life is there for someone like me after this?" "The kind you build, one day at a time." Jesse smiled sadly. "You always were the optimistic one." "Someone has to be." They finished the bottle as the stars wheeled overhead, and when Jesse finally stood to head back to his tent, he paused. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said, "I'm glad you came back. I know I didn't say it before, but I am." Caleb nodded, throat tight. "Me too." They rode out at dawn, 100 men on horseback, moving through the pre-dawn darkness like a river of shadow and steel. No one spoke. The only sounds were hoofbeats, the creak of leather, the soft jingle of tack. Garrison Hill rose out of the landscape like a fist. a fortified position built on high ground, surrounded by earthworks and wooden palisades. Caleb could see sentries moving along the walls, torches burning at intervals. Rourke raised a hand, and the column stopped. He turned in his saddle, looking back at the men spread out behind him. "You all know what to do. Hit them hard, hit them fast, and don't stop until it's done. This is for everyone we've lost, everyone they took from us. Make it count." Then he drew his pistol, kicked his horse forward, and the world exploded into chaos. The attack was pure fury and desperation. They came at the garrison from three sides, riders screaming war cries as they charged the outer defenses. Union soldiers scrambled to respond, shouting orders, firing into the mass of oncoming horses and men. Caleb rode hard, rifle in one hand, reins in the other, Jesse at his side. Bullets whined past his head, kicked up dirt around the horse's hooves. A man to his left jerked and fell, horse continuing forward without him. The outer palisade loomed, and Caleb saw men with axes hacking at the wooden posts, trying to create a breach. Gunfire tore through them, dropping 2, then 3. But others took their places. "Go! Go!" someone was shouting, and then the wall gave way and they were through, pouring into the compound like water through a broken dam. Inside was pandemonium. Union soldiers formed firing lines, officers screaming orders, artillery crews trying to bring their guns to bear. Rourke's men crashed into them like a wave, and suddenly it was all close-quarters hell, pistols firing point blank, men grappling hand to hand, knives flashing in the early morning light. Caleb dismounted, rifle empty, and drew his pistol. A Union soldier came at him with a bayonet, and Caleb shot him, moved to the next target without thinking. Jesse was beside him, firing methodically, covering Caleb's back. "Keep moving," Jesse shouted. "Don't get pinned down." They pushed deeper into the compound, following Rourke's group toward the command building. Bodies littered the ground, Union and Outlaw both. Impossible to tell who was winning. Then the artillery opened up. The first shell screamed overhead and exploded in the center of the compound, throwing men and horses into the air like toys. The concussion knocked Caleb to his knees, ears ringing, vision swimming. Jesse grabbed his arm, hauled him up. "Move! They've got the range!" Another shell hit, closer this time, and Caleb felt the shockwave in his chest. Men were scattering, the assault breaking apart as the artillery found its rhythm. Rourke was still pushing forward, a corps of maybe 20 men with him, fighting toward the command building like nothing else mattered. "He's going to get himself killed," Caleb shouted over the noise. "Then let's make sure we're not with him when he does." Jesse pulled him towards cover behind an overturned wagon. They hunkered down as another shell exploded nearby, shrapnel screaming through the air. Caleb could see the assault falling apart, men retreating, horses running loose, the whole thing dissolving into a desperate scramble for survival. And then he saw Rourke reach the command building. He kicked in the door and disappeared inside with his men. Seconds later, gunfire erupted from within, muzzle flashes visible through the windows, the sharp crack of pistols and rifles in close quarters. "We have to pull back," Jesse said. "This is over." But before Caleb could respond, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A Union officer was dragging a civilian out of one of the side buildings. A young man, maybe 18, wearing work clothes. The officer threw him to his knees and drew his pistol. Caleb was moving before he could think, sprinting across open ground, shouting, "No, don't!" The officer turned, surprised, and Caleb tackled him before he could fire. They went down hard, rolling in the dirt, and Caleb felt a fist connect with his jaw, saw stars. He got his hands around the officer's throat, squeezed, felt the man thrash beneath him. Then Jesse was there, pulling him off. "Caleb, stop! He's done!" The officer lay gasping, not dead, but not fighting anymore. The young civilian stared at them, wide-eyed and shaking. "Please, I didn't—" "Get out of here," Caleb told him. "Run. Now." The kid didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled to his feet and bolted for the broken section of palisade. Jesse grabbed Caleb's shoulder. "We need to go, right now." They ran for the horses, mounted, and rode hard for the breach. Behind them, the artillery continued to pound, and Caleb could hear Rourke's voice shouting orders, still fighting even as everything fell apart around him. They made it through the palisade and kept riding, didn't slow down until the garrison was a mile behind them, and the sounds of battle had faded to distant echoes. Caleb pulled his horse to a stop, breathing hard, and looked back. Smoke rose from Garrison Hill in thick black columns, visible for miles. Jesse reined in beside him. Think Rourke made it out? I don't know. They waited at the rendezvous point for 2 hours. Men trickled in, some wounded, some in shock, all of them looking like they'd been through a meat grinder. By the time the sun was high overhead, maybe 40 had made it back. Rourke wasn't among them. Cole rode in near the end, blood streaming down his face from a gash above his eye. Where's Rourke? Someone asked. Cole shook his head. Don't know. Last I saw he was in the command building. Building caught fire. I didn't see him come out. A heavy silence fell over the group. So what do we do now? Another man asked. Cole looked around at the survivors, then shrugged helplessly. I don't know. Without Rourke, I don't know. That's when they heard the hoofbeats. Everyone grabbed for weapons, but it was just one rider, Garrett, covered in soot and ash, leading a second horse. Rourke was slumped in the saddle, barely conscious, his shirt soaked with blood. Help me get him down, Garrett said. They laid Rourke on the ground, and Caleb saw immediately how bad it was. A bullet had caught him in the side, and the wound was bleeding heavily. His breathing was shallow, labored. Rourke's eyes fluttered open, focused on Caleb. Did we, win? Caleb didn't know what to say to that. We held them, Garrett lied smoothly. Tore them up good. They won't forget this. Rourke smiled weakly. Good. That's good. He passed out, and they worked frantically to stop the bleeding, to keep him alive. But Caleb knew, watching the life drain out of him, that even if Rourke survived the wound, something fundamental had broken. The raid on Garrison Hill had been a disaster. They'd lost more than half their men, accomplished nothing, and painted an even bigger target on everyone's back. And for what? Revenge? Pride? Some desperate need to prove they still mattered? Caleb sat apart from the others, watching them try to save Rourke, and felt something inside him finally snap. This had to end. One way or another, it had to end. Jesse sat down beside him, silent for a long moment. You were right, Jesse said finally. This is insane. All of it. Caleb looked at his brother. So what are we going to do about it? Jesse stared at the ground. I don't know, but I can't keep doing this. I'm done. Then we leave. Tonight. Before it gets worse. Jesse nodded slowly. Yeah, all right. They waited until dark, until most of the camp was asleep or too exhausted to pay attention. Rourke was still unconscious, fevered and delirious. Cole and a few others were keeping watch, but they were stretched thin, focused on their leader. Caleb and Jesse gathered their things quietly, saddled their horses in the dark. As they led them toward the edge of camp, Cole stepped out of the shadows. Going somewhere? Caleb's hand moved to his pistol, but Cole raised his hands. Easy. I'm not stopping you. He looked between them, something like envy in his eyes. Truth is, I wish I had the guts to do the same. Why don't you? Jesse asked. Cole smiled sadly. Because I've got nowhere else to go. This is all I know. But you two, you're young enough to start over, so go. Get out while you still can. Caleb hesitated. What about Rourke? He'll live or he won't. Either way, it's not your problem anymore. Cole stepped aside. Go on, and if anyone asks, I never saw you. They mounted and rode out into the darkness, leaving behind the camp, the brotherhood, and everything they'd been. Behind them, Rourke Maddox lay dying in a tent, surrounded by men who didn't know if they were supposed to save him or let him go, and ahead of them was nothing but open country and the uncertain promise of something better. Caleb didn't look back. Not this time. They rode through the night without speaking, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the broken remains of Rourke's war. The horses were tired, stumbling occasionally on the rough terrain, but Caleb and Jesse pushed them forward until the eastern sky began to lighten with the promise of dawn. By the time they stopped to rest, they'd covered nearly 30 miles. Jesse dismounted first, legs unsteady, and leaned against a cottonwood tree. How far are you planning to run? Caleb swung down from his saddle, wincing at the stiffness in his back. Far as it takes. And then what? I don't know yet. Jesse laughed, hollow and exhausted. That's real comforting, Caleb. Real solid plan you got there. You got a better one? Jesse didn't answer. He just slid down to sit at the base of the tree, head tipped back, eyes closed. Caleb tended to the horses, checking their legs for injuries, making sure they had water from a nearby creek. The morning air was cool and clean, carrying the smell of sage and damp earth, and for the first time in months, Caleb felt like he could actually breathe. He sat down beside Jesse, pulled out a piece of hardtack, and forced himself to eat even though he wasn't hungry. "You think he'll come after us?" Jesse asked without opening his eyes. "Rourke? If he lives, maybe, but he's got bigger problems than us right now. Cole said the union's offering $5,000 for him. That kind of money makes men do terrible things." Caleb thought about the survivors they'd left behind, desperate, broken men who'd watched their leader bleed out in the dirt. Someone'll turn on him eventually. It's just a matter of time. Jesse finally opened his eyes, looking at Caleb. "You feel bad about leaving?" "No." "Liar." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I feel bad about a lot of things. But leaving, that's the first thing I've done in 2 years that actually feels right." They stayed by the creek for a few hours, letting the horses rest and regain their strength. Jesse dozed fitfully while Caleb kept watch, rifle across his knees, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Nothing came. When the sun was high overhead, they mounted up and continued west. For 3 days, they moved like ghosts through the countryside, avoiding towns and main roads, sleeping rough and eating whatever they could hunt or forage. They crossed into Kansas territory on the 4th day, and the landscape began to change. Rolling grasslands giving way to flatter terrain, the sky opening up vast and blue. On the 5th night, they camped near an abandoned homestead, just a burned-out shell of a cabin and a collapsed barn, remnants of someone else's failed dream. Jesse sat by the fire, poking at the flames with a stick. "You ever think about Pa?" Caleb was cleaning his rifle, hands moving on autopilot. "Sometimes." "Think he's still alive?" "I hope so." "You think he'd take us back, if we showed up?" Caleb looked at his brother across the fire. "I think he'd ask what we've done. And I don't think either of us has an answer he'd want to hear." Jesse nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's what I figured." They fell silent, both of them staring into the flames, thinking about home and all the ways they'd lost it. "So where are we going?" Jesse asked eventually. "We can't just wander forever." "West. Maybe Colorado territory, find work on a ranch or in a mine, somewhere the war hasn't reached yet." "You think places like that still exist?" "They have to." Jesse smiled faintly. "There you go, being optimistic again." "Someone has to be." They crossed into Colorado territory 2 weeks later, half-starved and down to their last few dollars. The mountains rose in the distance like a promise, snow-capped peaks catching the sunlight and holding it. They found work in a mining town called Silver Ridge, tucked into a narrow valley between steep hillsides. The town was rough, a collection of saloons, supply stores, and hastily built shacks that housed men chasing dreams of gold and silver. Caleb and Jesse hired on with a mining company, hauling ore from the deep shafts up to the surface. The work was brutal, 12-hour days in near darkness, breathing dust and trying not to think about cave-ins or bad air. But it was honest work, and after everything they'd been through, that mattered. They rented a room above a general store, sharing a cramped space that barely fit 2 cots and their meager belongings. At night, they'd wash the dust off and walk to one of the saloons for a meal and a drink, listening to miners swap stories and prospectors argue about claims. Nobody asked where they'd come from, and Caleb and Jesse didn't volunteer the information. For the first month, Caleb waited for the past to catch up with them. Every stranger who rode into town, every unfamiliar face, made him reach for the pistol he kept hidden under his coat. But nothing happened. The war continued to rage back east, but here in the mountains it felt distant and unreal. Just stories in month-old newspapers that circulated through the saloons. Jesse seemed to settle in more easily than Caleb expected. He made friends with some of the other miners, learned to play cards without losing too much money, even started courting a widow who ran a boarding house on the edge of town. Caleb watched his brother slowly come back to life and felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe they could actually do this. Maybe they could start over. Then, 6 weeks after they arrived, Garrett walked into the saloon. Caleb saw him immediately, standing just inside the door, scanning the room. Their eyes met, and Garrett's expression shifted from surprise to something harder. Jesse noticed Caleb tense. What's wrong? We've got company. Garrett crossed the room and sat down at their table without being invited. He looked thinner than Caleb remembered, worn down by hard miles and harder living. Didn't expect to find you boys here, Garrett said. Caleb kept his hand near his pistol, hidden beneath the table. We're just passing through. That right? Funny way to pass through, working a mine for 6 weeks. What do you want, Garrett? Garrett leaned back, studying them both. Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just surprised to see familiar faces, that's all. Jesse spoke up. How'd you even find us? Luck, mostly. I've been drifting since Garrison Hill, picking up work where I can find it. Heard there were jobs here, so I came looking. He signaled the bartender for a drink. Didn't know you'd be here, too. Caleb didn't relax. What happened after we left? Garrett's expression darkened. Rourke lived. Took him weeks to recover, and he's still not right. Lost the use of his left arm, can barely ride. But he's alive. And the others? Scattered. Some went south, some disappeared into Indian territory. Cole took what was left of the ammunition and supplies, sold it to a Confederate unit for enough money to get drunk for a month. Garrett accepted his whiskey from the bartender, downed it in one swallow. It's over, Caleb. Whatever Rourke built, it's gone. Good, Jesse said firmly. Garrett looked at him. You mean that? Every word. What about you, Caleb? You feel the same? Caleb met his eyes. I feel like I should have left a long time ago. Should have dragged Jesse with me before Red Hollow, before any of it got that bad. Garrett nodded slowly. For what it's worth, you weren't the only one thinking that. A lot of us stayed because we didn't know what else to do. Didn't know how to be anything except what Rourke made us. And now? Garrett shrugged. Now I'm a miner. Or trying to be. Turns out swinging a pickaxe is harder than I thought. Despite everything, Caleb almost smiled. Yeah, it is. Garrett stayed in Silver Ridge. He found work in the same mine, and gradually, carefully, something like friendship rebuilt itself between the three of them. They didn't talk about the war. Didn't reminisce about old raids or fallen comrades. They just worked, drank, and tried to forget. 3 months passed, then 4. The rhythm of mining life became familiar. Wake before dawn, descend into darkness, haul ore until your back screamed, surface at sunset, eat, sleep, repeat. Caleb started to believe they might actually be safe. Then the Union Army arrived. They came into Silver Ridge on a cold November morning, a full company of cavalry led by a captain named Morrison. The soldiers fanned out through the town, checking papers, asking questions, looking for deserters and fugitives. Caleb was coming out of the mine when he saw them. He grabbed Jesse's arm, pulling him back into the shadows. What? Union patrol. A big one. Jesse peered around the entrance. You think they're looking for us specifically? I don't know, but we can't take the chance. They slipped out the back entrance to the mine, circling around through the hills to reach their room at the general store. Garrett was already there, packing his things in a hurry. You see them? He asked. Caleb nodded. We need to move. Now. Agreed. But where? They've got men on all the roads out of town. Jesse moved to the window, peering down at the street. We could wait them out. They're probably just passing through. As if in answer, they heard boots on the stairs. Heavy, purposeful footsteps coming up toward their room. Caleb drew his pistol. Jesse and Garrett did the same. A knock on the door. Open up. Union Army. Caleb looked at the others, saw his own tension reflected in their faces. They could fight, but they'd never make it out of town alive. They could surrender, but that meant prison at best, hanging at worst. The knock came again, harder. I said, open up. Caleb made a decision. He holstered his pistol and opened the door. Captain Morrison stood in the hallway with 4 soldiers behind him. He was younger than Caleb expected, maybe 30, with sharp features and eyes that missed nothing. You the miners who just started working here 6 weeks back? Morrison asked. Yes, sir. Names? Caleb used the alias he'd been working under. Tom Harris. This is my brother Jim and our friend Sam. Morrison studied them, then pulled out a piece of paper. I'm looking for men who rode with an outlaw named Rourke Maddox. You heard of him? No, sir. That's funny, because I've got descriptions that match all 3 of you. Morrison stepped into the room and the soldiers followed. You boys fought in the war? No, sir. Been working mines since before it started. Is that right? Morrison walked slowly around the room, looking at their belongings. He picked up Caleb's rifle, examined it. This is a military issue. Where'd you get it? Bought it off a prospector. Uh-huh. Morrison set the rifle down, turned to face Caleb directly. I'm going to ask you one more time. Did you ride with Rourke Maddox? Caleb held his gaze. No, sir. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, and Caleb could see him weighing options, calculating odds. Then Morrison smiled, cold and knowing. All right, but I'll be keeping an eye on you boys, and if I find out you're lying to me, I'll come back, and next time I won't be asking questions. He turned and walked out, soldiers following. Caleb let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That was too close, Garrett muttered. Yeah. Caleb moved to the window, watching Morrison and his men mount up and ride toward the other end of town. We can't stay here. Even if he believed us, which he didn't, he's going to be watching. Jesse nodded. So we leave tonight. And go where? Garrett asked. They'll be looking for us now. Every town, every checkpoint. Caleb thought about it, weighing their options. North, up into the high country. There are settlements up there, trappers, prospectors, people who don't ask questions. We can disappear. In winter? We'll freeze. It's better than hanging. They packed what they could carry, waited until after midnight, and slipped out of Silver Ridge like thieves. The journey north was brutal. Winter had already settled into the mountains, and the temperature dropped well below freezing at night. They followed old trapper trails, avoiding settlements, living off dried meat and whatever game they could shoot. Jesse's cough started on the 5th day. Just a tickle at first, but it got progressively worse. By the end of the first week, he was running a fever. I'm fine, he insisted, but Caleb could see he wasn't. They pushed on, climbing higher into the mountains, and finally reached a small settlement called Timber Creek. It was barely a town, just a trading post, a handful of cabins, and a lot of suspicious faces. The trading post owner, a grizzled man named Dutch, looked them over carefully before agreeing to rent them a cabin. You running from something? He asked bluntly. Just looking for work, Caleb said. Dutch snorted. Sure you are. Well, long as you don't bring trouble here, I don't care. Cabin's 50 feet that way. Rent's due every week. They got Jesse into the cabin and tried to make him comfortable. Garrett went to find a doctor, if such a thing existed this far from civilization. He came back an hour later with an old woman who introduced herself as May. I'm not a doctor, she said, kneeling beside Jesse's cot. But I've treated enough pneumonia to know it when I see it. Your brother's in bad shape. Can you help him? Caleb asked. Maybe. Depends on how strong he is. She pulled out various herbs and tinctures from a worn leather bag. I'll do what I can, but you need to keep him warm and make sure he drinks. Lots of fluids. Over the next week, Jesse hovered between life and death. The fever raged, and there were nights when Caleb sat beside him, listening to his brother's labored breathing, wondering if this was how it would end, not with bullets or violence, but with sickness in a freezing cabin at the edge of nowhere. But Jesse was tougher than he looked. Slowly, painfully, he began to improve. The fever broke, the cough eased, and color returned to his face. May came every day to check on him, and Caleb paid her what little money they had left. He's going to make it, she said finally. But he needs rest, real rest, not running through the mountains in winter. We don't have a choice, Caleb said. There's always a choice. May looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. You boys are running from something. I don't know what, and I don't care. But eventually, you're going to have to stop. You can't outrun your past forever. We can try. You can, but it'll kill you. Or worse, it'll kill him. She gestured to Jesse. That boy's been through hell. He deserves a chance to rest, to heal, to be something other than a fugitive. Her words stayed with Caleb long after she left. Jesse recovered slowly. By late December, he was strong enough to walk around the cabin, and by January, he was helping with chores. Garrett found work cutting timber, and Caleb hired on with him. The work was hard and cold, but it kept them fed and gave them purpose. Timber Creek was isolated enough that news from the outside world came slowly and filtered through multiple sources. They heard about Sherman's march, about battles won and lost, about the war grinding toward some inevitable conclusion. One night in February, Dutch came by the cabin with news. "Got a traveler through here earlier," he said. "Says Rourke Maddox is dead." Caleb felt something twist in his chest. How? Turned on by his own men, apparently. They collected the bounty and split it. Happened down in Arkansas a couple weeks back. Garrett swore softly. Jesse just stared into the fire. "Thought you boys might want to know," Dutch said, "seeing as how you seemed interested when his name came up before." After Dutch left, the three of them sat in silence. Finally, Jesse spoke. "You feel anything about Rourke?" Caleb thought about it. About the man who'd taken them in, taught them how to survive, and then led them into darkness. "I don't know. Relief, maybe, that it's over." "Is it, though?" Garrett asked. "The bounty's claimed, but there's still people out there who remember what we did. The families in Red Hollow, the soldiers at Garrison Hill. They don't forget." "No," Caleb agreed. "They don't. But maybe that's something we have to live with. Maybe that's the price." Jesse looked at him. "You really think we can just live normal lives after everything we've done?" "I think we have to try. Because the alternative is becoming exactly what Rourke became. And I'd rather die than let that happen." Spring came to the mountains in fits and starts. Snow melting to reveal muddy ground, ice breaking up in the streams, green pushing through dead grass. Caleb, Jesse, and Garrett stayed in Timber Creek, working timber and keeping their heads down. They didn't talk about the past unless they had to, didn't dwell on what they'd lost or who they used to be. Morrison's men never came looking for them. Either the captain had bigger problems, or he'd decided 3 miners weren't worth the effort. Either way, they were safe. For now. One evening in early May, Caleb and Jesse sat outside their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. "You ever regret it?" Jesse asked. "Leaving Rourke? Walking away?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I regret a lot of things, but that's not one of them." "What do you regret?" "Not leaving sooner, not taking you with me after the first raid, believing that loyalty meant following someone no matter what they became." Jesse nodded. "Yeah, me too." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell and stars began to appear overhead. "You think we'll ever be able to go home?" Jesse asked. "I don't know. Maybe someday, when the war's over and enough time has passed." Caleb looked at his brother. "But I think maybe home's not a place anymore. Maybe it's just this, you and me, still alive, still trying." Jesse smiled faintly. "When'd you get so philosophical?" "I've had a lot of time to think." In the cabin behind them, Garrett was cooking dinner, the smell of beans and salt pork drifting out into the evening air. 3 men who'd been outlaws, who'd ridden with Rourke Maddox and survived what came after. 3 men trying to build something new from the wreckage of who they used to be. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And sometimes, Caleb thought, a start was all you needed. The war ended in April of 1865, but the news didn't reach Timber Creek until June. A prospector came through with a month-old newspaper, and Dutch posted it outside the trading post for anyone who cared to read. Caleb stood in the mud, staring at the headline, "Confederate Surrender," and felt nothing. No relief, no celebration, just a hollow acknowledgement that something massive had ended and the world would keep turning regardless. Jesse read it over his shoulder. "It's over." "Yeah." "You think things will get better now?" Caleb folded the paper and handed it back to Dutch. "I think things will just be different. Whether that's better or not, I guess we'll find out." Garrett had been standing nearby, listening. "War might be over, but that doesn't mean they'll stop looking for men like us. Probably makes it easier, actually. No more fighting to distract them." "So what are you saying?" Jesse asked. "We stay here forever?" "I'm saying we stay careful." Garrett's eyes scanned the tree line, a habit none of them had been able to break. "At least until we know how the dust settles." They stayed careful. Through summer and into fall, they worked timber and kept to themselves. But Timber Creek was changing, more people arriving, drawn by rumors of gold in the higher elevations. The settlement expanded, adding new cabins, a second trading post, even talk of a proper saloon. With growth came scrutiny. One afternoon in late September, Caleb was hauling logs when he noticed a man watching him from across the creek. The stranger was well-dressed, Too clean for a prospector, and he had the alert stillness of someone accustomed to violence. Caleb kept working, but marked the man's position. When he looked again an hour later, the stranger was gone. That night, he mentioned it to Jesse and Garrett. Could be nothing, Jesse said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe that. Could be a bounty hunter, Garrett countered. War's over, but there's still money on wanted men. And we're definitely wanted. For what exactly, Jesse asked. We never got charged with anything official, never got our names on any list. You think that matters? We rode with Rourke Maddox, that's enough for some people. Caleb stood and grabbed his coat. I'm going to talk to Dutch, see if he knows anything about the stranger. Dutch was closing up the trading post when Caleb arrived. He took one look at Caleb's face and sighed. You're wondering about the man in the black coat. You know him? Know of him. Name's Henry Voss. Used to be a detective back east. Now he tracks men for money. Dutch locked the door and turned to face Caleb. He came by asking about 3 miners who arrived last winter. Described you boys pretty accurately. Caleb's hand moved instinctively toward his pistol. What did you tell him? Told him I got a lot of miners passing through, can't keep track of everyone. But he's not stupid, Caleb. He knows you're here. Why hasn't he made a move? Because he's smart. He's waiting to be sure, gathering evidence, maybe trying to figure out if you're worth the risk. Dutch's expression softened. I like you boys. You've been good tenants, caused no trouble, but I'm not going to lie to the law for you. If Voss comes back with proof, I'll have to tell him what I know. Caleb nodded slowly. I understand. I hope you do, because you've got maybe a week before he makes his move. Use it wisely. Caleb walked back to the cabin, mind racing. They could run again, but winter was coming and their funds were nearly gone. They could fight, but killing a bounty hunter would only bring more trouble. Or they could face it. Finally stop running and see if there was any justice left in the world. Jesse and Garrett were waiting when he returned. Well? Garrett asked. Bounty hunter, name's Voss. Dutch says he's asking questions. Jesse swore. We need to leave, tonight. And go where? Caleb asked. We're almost broke, winter's coming, and now we've got a professional tracker who knows our faces. We run now, we'll be running forever. So what's the alternative? Wait for him to arrest us? Caleb sat down heavily on his cot. Maybe. Or maybe we try something different. Garrett stared at him. You're not seriously suggesting we turn ourselves in. I'm suggesting we stop letting our past control our future. Caleb looked between them. We've spent 2 years running, hiding, living like ghosts. I'm tired, Jesse. Aren't you tired? Jesse's expression was conflicted. Yeah, but I'm not ready to die either. Maybe we won't have to. The war's over. They're letting soldiers go home, pardoning deserters, trying to put the country back together. Maybe there's room in that for people like us. People like us murdered civilians, Garrett said flatly. Burned towns. You think they're just going to forgive that? No, but maybe they'll let us serve our time and move on. Maybe that's the best we can hope for. Jesse shook his head. You're insane. Probably. But I'd rather face whatever comes than spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. They argued late into the night, but Caleb's mind was made up. The next morning, he walked into town alone and found Voss sitting outside the new saloon drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. Caleb sat down across from him without being invited. Voss looked up, unsurprised. Mr. Kane, or should I say Mr. Harris? Kane's fine. You already know who I am. I do. Voss folded his newspaper. The question is, what are you planning to do about it? I'm planning to make this easy on both of us. I'll come with you, testify to whatever you need, on one condition. Voss raised an eyebrow. You're in no position to make conditions. My brother and Garrett had nothing to do with Red Hollow. They weren't there when Rourke executed that boy. I was. If someone needs to answer for that, it should be me. That's noble. Also a lie. I have witness statements placing all 3 of you at multiple raids, including Red Hollow. Caleb held his gaze. Then take me and let the courts decide. But leave Jesse and Garrett out of it. They've suffered enough. Voss studied him for a long moment. Why are you doing this? Because I'm tired of running. Because I watched Rourke Maddox tear himself apart trying to outrun his guilt, and I won't end up like him. Caleb leaned forward. I did things I can't take back. I know that. but I'm not going to spend the rest of my life pretending they didn't happen. Voss took a sip of his coffee. You know they might hang you. Yeah. And you're willing to take that chance? If it means my brother gets to live a normal life? Yes. Voss was quiet, considering. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a set of iron shackles. All right, Mr. Kane. Let's see if your honor is worth anything to a judge. Jesse tried to stop them as Voss led Caleb to his horse. Don't do this, Jesse pleaded. We can fight him. We can run. No. Caleb's hands were already shackled, but his voice was steady. This is the right thing, Jesse, for both of us. How can you say that? They're going to hang you. Maybe. Or maybe they'll give me a chance to make things right. Either way, you and Garrett are free. That's what matters. Jesse's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I can't lose you, Caleb. You're all I've got left. Caleb managed to smile despite the weight of the shackles. You've got yourself. You've got a future. Don't waste it on guilt or revenge or any of the things that destroyed Rourke. Promise me. Jesse grabbed his brother's shoulder. I promise. But I'm not giving up on you. I'll find a lawyer. I'll testify. Jesse. Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. Let me do this. Please. Voss cleared his throat. We need to move. Caleb looked at his brother one last time, memorizing his face. Then he turned and let Voss lead him away. The journey to Denver took 2 weeks. Voss proved to be a surprisingly decent captor. He kept Caleb fed, didn't mistreat him, and even allowed him to ride unshackled during the day as long as he gave his word not to run. Why are you being so reasonable about this? Caleb asked one evening as they made camp. Voss poked at their fire. Because you surrendered. Most men I hunt, I have to drag them in kicking and screaming. You walked up and sat down like you were ordering breakfast. That deserves some respect. Even though I'm a killer? We're all killers, Mr. Kane. The war made sure of that. The difference is whether we own what we've done or spend our lives making excuses. They reached Denver in mid-October. The city was bigger than Caleb expected, full of soldiers mustering out, refugees looking for new starts, and the general chaos of a nation trying to rebuild. Voss turned Caleb over to the military authorities, who held him in a makeshift stockade while they figured out what to do with him. The trial took 3 months to arrange. In that time, Caleb lived in a cell barely big enough to stand in, eating thin soup and stale bread, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Jesse came to visit whenever the guards allowed it. He'd found work in Denver as a carpenter and was saving money for a lawyer, though Caleb repeatedly told him not to bother. You need to let this go, Caleb said during one visit. Move on with your life. I will, after they let you go. Jesse? Don't. Jesse's voice was sharp. Don't ask me to abandon you. I won't do it. Garrett visited too, though less frequently. He'd stayed in Timber Creek initially, but eventually drifted to Denver looking for work. Place is full of opportunities, he told Caleb. People building, expanding, war's over, and everyone wants to pretend it never happened. That include us? Garrett's expression darkened. No, people like us don't get to forget. But maybe we can earn our way to something better. The trial finally convened in January of 1866. The courtroom was packed, journalists, curious onlookers, and a handful of people who claimed to be survivors of Red Hollow. The prosecutor was a thin man named Caldwell, who laid out the charges with cold precision. Caleb Kane, formerly of Rourke Maddox's Outlaw band, was accused of participating in multiple raids, including the attack on Red Hollow that resulted in civilian casualties. The evidence was circumstantial, but damning. Witness statements, descriptions, the testimony of other captured outlaws who'd turned on their former comrades in exchange for leniency. Caleb's defense attorney, a tired-looking man named Harrison, whom Jesse had scraped together enough money to hire, did his best to argue that Caleb had been young, coerced, and had ultimately rejected Rourke's leadership by deserting. My client was 17 when he first rode with Maddox, Harrison argued. Barely more than a child, following his older brother out of loyalty and desperation. Yes, he participated in raids. Yes, he fired weapons. But he also walked away when he realized what they'd become. That takes courage, Your Honor. That takes conscience. Caldwell countered sharply. Conscience? He participated in the murder of innocent civilians. He rode with a man who executed an unarmed boy in front of the child's mother. Walking away afterward doesn't absolve him of those crimes. The judge, a stern man named Whitmore, listened to both sides with an unreadable expression. When it came time for Caleb to testify, Harrison advised him to show remorse but not admit specific guilt. Caleb ignored that advice. "I was there," he said simply. "At Red Hollow, at Garrison Hill, at half a dozen other raids. I fired my weapon, I followed orders, and I watched Rourke Maddox shoot a boy who was begging for his life." The courtroom went silent. "Why didn't you stop him?" Judge Whitmore asked. "Because I was a coward. Because I'd spent 2 years believing that loyalty meant following someone no matter what they became. By the time I realized how wrong that was, it was too late." "And yet you eventually left." "Yes, sir. Not soon enough, but I left." "Why should this court show you mercy, Mr. Kane? What makes you different from any other outlaw we've prosecuted?" Caleb thought about that. "Nothing, Your Honor. I'm not asking for mercy. I'm just asking to tell the truth about what happened and accept whatever consequences come with it." Judge Whitmore studied him for a long moment. "The truth is a rare commodity in times of war, Mr. Kane. Men usually prefer comfortable lies. I've lived with lies long enough. I'm done with them." The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution called witnesses who described the horror of Red Hollow, buildings burning, people screaming, the chaos and violence of 300 armed men descending on a helpless town. The defense countered with character witnesses: Dutch, who testified that Caleb had been a good tenant and hard worker; Garrett, who described how Caleb had saved a civilian's life during the Garrison Hill raid; even Jesse, who spoke about his brother's essential decency despite the darkness of war. When the jury retired to deliberate, Caleb was led back to his cell. Jesse was allowed a brief visit before the verdict. "Whatever happens," Jesse said, gripping the bars between them, "I'm proud of you, for standing up, for telling the truth." "Even if they hang me for it?" "Even then," Jesse's voice broke slightly, "because you're right. We can't outrun what we've done. We can only face it and try to be better." The jury returned after 6 hours. Caleb stood as Judge Whitmore read the verdict. On the charge of participating in armed raids resulting in civilian casualties, the jury finds the defendant guilty. Caleb's heart sank, but he kept his expression neutral. "However," Whitmore continued, "the jury also finds significant mitigating circumstances. The defendant's youth at the time of the crimes, his eventual desertion from the outlaw band, and his voluntary surrender all weigh in his favor." The judge paused, looking directly at Caleb. "Mr. Kane, war brings out the worst in men. It creates situations where ordinary people do terrible things. The question before this court is whether you are irredeemable or whether you deserve a chance to atone for your actions." Caleb barely dared to breathe. "I sentence you to 10 years of hard labor, with the possibility of early release contingent on good behavior and demonstrated rehabilitation. You will serve your time at the territorial prison in Cannon City, and upon completion, you will be granted a full pardon for all crimes committed during the war." Relief flooded through Caleb so powerfully he almost collapsed. 10 years, not a death sentence. A chance. As they led him out of the courtroom, he caught Jesse's eye. His brother was crying openly, but he was also smiling. Caleb smiled back. The prison at Cannon City was brutal, a stone fortress where men broke rocks under the Colorado sun and fought to survive each day. But Caleb had survived worse. He kept his head down, did his work, and refused to let the walls break him. Jesse visited twice a year, bringing news from the outside world. He'd married the widow from Silver Ridge and moved to Denver, where he'd started his own carpentry business. Garrett had gone west to California, chasing rumors of opportunity. "He asked me to tell you goodbye," Jesse said during one visit. "Said he hopes you find what you're looking for." "Tell him I hope he finds it too." The years passed slowly. Caleb turned 25 in prison, then 30. He watched other men give up hope, watched them turn mean and vicious, and he made a conscious choice not to follow that path. He read books when he could get them, learned basic mathematics from another prisoner, and spent his evenings in his cell thinking about what he'd do when he got out. He wouldn't go back to Timber Creek or Silver Ridge. Too many memories there. Instead, he'd head somewhere new, somewhere the war hadn't reached, and he'd build something that mattered. Maybe a farm, maybe a ranch, something honest. In his 8th year, the warden called him to the office. "You've got a visitor, Kane. Special circumstances." Caleb was led to a private meeting room where a woman in her 40s sat waiting. She had graying hair and eyes that held both sorrow and strength. "Mr. Kane," she said, "my name is Margaret Hollis. I was in Red Hollow the day your group attacked." Caleb's throat went dry. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't... My son was killed that day," she continued, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "Thomas. He was 16 years old." Caleb felt like he'd been kicked in the chest. "Ma'am, I'm not here for your apology, Mr. Kane. I'm here because I need to understand. The man who killed my son, Rourke Maddox, he's dead. And most of the others who rode with him are either dead or disappeared. You're the only one who faced justice, the only one who stood up and took responsibility." She paused, gathering herself. "I need to know why. Why you did it. Why you rode with them in the first place, and why you eventually stopped." Caleb sat down heavily. For the next hour, he told her everything. About following Jesse into Rourke's band, about the slow descent into violence, about Red Hollow and Garrison Hill, and the moment he finally walked away. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. "Thank you for your honesty," she said finally. "I don't forgive you, Mr. Kane. I don't know if I ever can. My son is still dead, and nothing you say will change that. I know. But I believe you when you say you regret it, and I believe you're trying to be better. For what it's worth, I hope you succeed." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. The world needs men who are willing to face what they've done instead of running from it. We've had too much violence, too much hatred. Maybe you can be part of building something different. After she left, Caleb sat alone in the room for a long time, staring at his hands. He'd never forget what he'd done. Never stop carrying the weight of Red Hollow. But maybe, just maybe, he could do something meaningful with the time he had left. Caleb was released in the spring of 1874, 2 years early for good behavior. He walked out of Cannon City Prison wearing donated clothes and carrying $20 in his pocket, everything he owned in the world. Jesse was waiting with a wagon. "Ready to start over?" his brother asked. Caleb climbed up beside him. "Yeah, I think I am." They drove to a small homestead Jesse had purchased in the foothills west of Denver. It wasn't much, a cabin, a barn, 60 acres of rough land, but it was honest ground. "Thought we could work it together," Jesse said. "Build something that lasts." Caleb looked at the mountains rising in the distance, at the clean sky and open land, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. They worked the land for the next 2 decades, built a herd of cattle, planted crops, slowly expanded the homestead until it was a proper ranch. Jesse's children grew up there, learning to ride and work and take pride in honest labor. Caleb never married, but he was a devoted uncle. He taught Jesse's kids to shoot, to track, to read the weather and respect the land. And when they were old enough to ask about his past, he told them the truth. "I did terrible things when I was young," he said simply. "Things I can never take back. But I've spent every day since then trying to be better. That's all any of us can do." The stories about Rourke Maddox and his outlaw band faded over time, becoming the stuff of dime novels and exaggerated legends. Most people forgot the real horror, the real cost. They remembered only the romance of rebellion, the myth of noble outlaws fighting tyranny. Caleb never tried to correct those stories. He just lived his life quietly, working the land and trying to make each day count. In 1895, a young journalist tracked him down, hoping to write a story about the last surviving member of Rourke Maddox's band. Caleb refused to be interviewed. "That part of my life is over," he told the journalist. "Let it stay buried." "But people want to know the truth," the journalist insisted. "They want to understand what really happened." Caleb looked at him. This eager young man who'd never seen war, never faced the choice between loyalty and conscience. "The truth is that war makes monsters of ordinary men. It creates situations where there are no good choices, only terrible ones. And the real courage isn't in fighting, it's in knowing when to walk away." The journalist left disappointed, but Caleb didn't care. He'd said what needed saying. Jesse died in 1903, peacefully in his sleep. At his funeral, his children and grandchildren spoke about his kindness, his strength, his dedication to family. Caleb stood apart from the crowd, remembering the scared boy who'd followed him into Rourke's camp, the loyal brother who'd refused to leave him even when it would have been smarter. "You made it," Caleb whispered. "You got to live a real life. That's all I wanted." Caleb lived on the ranch until 1910, when age and old injuries finally caught up with him. He died on a spring morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains he'd called home for more than 30 years. His last thoughts weren't of Red Hollow or Garrison Hill or the violence of his youth. They were of the land, of Jesse's grandchildren playing in the fields, of the life he'd managed to build from the wreckage of who he'd been. In the end, that was his redemption. Not the absence of guilt, but the presence of something better. Years later, people would still occasionally ask about Caleb Kane and Rourke Maddox and the Outlaw band that had terrorized the borderlands during the war. The stories grew and changed with each telling, becoming less about the reality and more about the legend. But those who'd known Caleb in his later years, the neighbors, the ranch hands, Jesse's family, they remembered something different. They remembered a quiet man who worked hard, kept his word, and never ran from the truth. They remembered someone who'd made terrible mistakes and spent the rest of his life trying to make them right. And in a land that had seen too much violence, too much hatred, too much senseless death, that mattered more than any legend ever could. The ranch still stands today, worked by Jesse's descendants. And if you ask them about their great-uncle Caleb, they'll tell you he was a good man who'd lived through bad times and come out the other side still believing in the possibility of redemption. Because in the end, that's what his story was really about, not the violence or the running or the terrible choices. It was about a boy who crossed a line he thought he could never uncross, and a man who spent the rest of his life proving that wrong. That was Caleb Kane's real legacy, not the outlaw, not the ghost of Red Hollow, just a man who chose to be better, one hard day at a time, until the day he died. And sometimes, that's enough.